Hello, everyone. Welcome to another stream of the world of strategy. It's been 2 days since my shoulder surgery, so I only have one hand today. Wouldn't be much of trouble, as we will be talking mostly. So I decided to do a new stream on the world of strategy because I think it's pretty exciting and interesting to see where the recent developments in the Ukraine crisis will take us. Um, So I just wanted to share my thoughts on that real quick, and also give you a little bit of a lesson in terms of strategy when during a time of war or during a time of political tension, um, you can see the timeline shifting into a different phase as it does now in the current crisis in Ukraine. If I speak a little bit slower than normally, I'm very sorry. I'm a little bit under influence of medication right now due to post surgery, but I hope to be as concise and as coherent as possible in this stream. Okay, so the Ukrainian crisis has been probably going on now for a little close, a little over a month, depending on when you see this clip. And there are a lot of things that we can take away from the recent events that have taken place over the last couple of weeks. For one example, the Russian forces are doing very poorly still, especially in comparison to what everybody thought they were capable of prior to the invasion of Ukraine. We can say that Russia's main invasion force just isn't up to the task. And you can also see that in the political landscape and the things that are being said or being published by intelligence sources all around the world. We vastly overestimated the power of Russia's military, not just the sheer power of its military in terms of manpower, weaponry, or such, but mostly in its organizational structure and command system, which is really failing in this situation. So right now there is kind of like already a bridge being built between diplomatic relationships between diplomatic parties of Ukraine and of Russia, and of course that's probably how this whole situation will inevitably end with a diplomatic solution, because neither side has any interest or any gain, realistically speaking, from continuing an armed struggle for a prolonged period of time, especially Russia in this case. So, what I want to tell you about is a little bit give you an insight into um, the different strategic tools, if you will, needed to kind of navigate yourself through these various phases of war. So let's start with where the situation in Ukraine is right now. Okay, so they're still fighting. The Russians have taken some territory, but it's hardly noteworthy in comparison to what their objectives were to begin with before they started the invasion. I mean, the most important cities are still under Ukrainian control. Most of the country is still under Ukrainian control. Even if some of these cities are more besieged than others, there's still heavily fighting going on. So there's still no speak of complete surrender. The Russians still in operation. Ukrainian air defense is still operational, so that's still going on as well. Ukrainians are still getting military aid, financial aid, logistical aid from Western countries. So it's still an ongoing conflict. However, there are some attempts to discuss eventual terms, of changing the course of the conflict, or inevitably, or eventually, maybe end the conflict altogether. So that's something that I'm really focusing on in this stream, because militarily, what can we say? I mean, the Russians have played their hand, and it isn't really a good one, to be quite honest with you. I mean, they've shown their hand, and what's in their hand just wasn't as good or as prosperous as we thought it would be. And for the Western free world, it's a very positive development, I have to say. It's very positive realization, because if the Russians cannot overtake Ukraine by conventional force, it just doesn't add up. The Ukrainian military before this invasion was in no way noteworthy, was in no way advanced or developed. They have fought this war with sheer willpower and resourcefulness, which, as we see on the battlefield, is oftentimes just as, if not more important than sheer numbers and size. And I don't want to go into it too deep in this video, because I want spend this video really on the strategy in terms of diplomacy and what you can gain there. But like you have various sources in the world that for some reason or another are looked upon in terms of determining military power for each country. And the problem that I have with these sources, and the most important one is Global Firepower. It's a website. You can look it up, and it's actually it forms like this ranking list of supposedly strong military powers from weak to like strongest, and they're pretty much the only measurement is numbers and statistics, and there I have a real problem with that because war isn't won by sheer numbers. It's won oftentimes by the most disciplined, well structured, well organized chain of command. The party that has the most structured, organized form of command, which is like a well-oiled machine, which has the capability of collecting and disseminating in real time practical intelligence and get it to the units in the fastest periods of time, is usually the country that makes the most, or the military that makes the most progress in wartime. The one that has the most intelligence on the opposites forces, the most intelligence on the landscape, the more intelligence of the people residing in the country of said war. Those are oftentimes the most over the years. It has nothing to do with their numbers, because they aren't the biggest military, not in manpower or not in weapons. But what they do have is a very sophisticated and advanced weapon technology. And on top of that, a very well disciplined, battle hardened, structurized chain of command. A very well organized military that is used to cooperating within each other, within the various units of their command structures, and is being as capable of applying their forces, their divisions in real time in the manner that they need to be applied. And oftentimes in warfare, that's most of the time the deciding factor. And we even see it here again. I mean, the Russians have the numbers. The Russians even, you might say, have the technology, the more advanced weaponry, but it doesn't really do much for them right now. And the reason why that is that because they came into this war with the wrong intelligence, wrong estimates, wrong assessments of the opposition Ukrainian army and military could muster against them. Bad intelligence about the environment, bad assessments about their logistical capabilities, poor preparation on their logistics, bad communication between the various chains of commands and military districts, and it just destroys them from the inside. Um, so yeah, do numbers matter in war? Yes, absolutely. Is it an all-deciding factor? Absolutely not. So that's just what I want to share with you real quick. Now on to the main part of this video. Um, so I want to start with Zelensky. Zelensky for me is a very interesting figure because in the first phase of the war, he's become a national hero. When it needed to be done, he was the guy that helped the Ukrainians, that motivated them and inspired them to take up the arms against the Russians, that gave its country courage, gave its people courage. He stood with his people. He went to the battle lines. He wasn't trying to rescue his own assets, trying to save face. He was all about, okay, I have to get my country up in arms in order to fight these invaders with everything I've got. And that made him turn him into a national hero, and well deserved, because he really did an incredible job of not only inspiring his own country, but inspiring the rest of the free world in aiding Ukraine and strengthening any form of diplomatic or ties that he could muster. And he did an incredible job with that. However, now that phase is over. The first phase, the first blitzkrieg, the first part in which you have to inspire the country and you have to muster some sort of resistance is over. The resistance is mustered. The Ukrainians are up in arms. The battle lines are defined. The positions are taken. The trenches has been dug, so to speak. That part is over. So now you have to go transition into a different part. And in warfare, you have to realize that warfare is never static. Warfare is always moving from one phase to another. What's the reality last week might totally not be the reality anymore this week. What will be the reality this week might not even be the reality next week. And a great general or a great leader in war has the ability to adapt instantly to these various phases of warfare. That means you have to have various phases. You have to have various masks, various camouflages in order to navigate yourself through these various phases. Is Zelensky a guy that can do that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure because right now, for him, the most important thing should be getting as much out of these diplomatic meetings with the Russians as is absolutely possible, because that is will be eventually his free ticket out of this war. This is true for Zelensky, and it is also true for Putin. However, my fear with Zelensky is that he has grown so accustomed to this iron fist wartime leader that it will be incredibly difficult for him to make the adaptation to a more diplomatic, calm, balanced kind of individual who can shrewdly but tactically navigate himself into a proper deal. And that's what Ukraine needs right now. The guy that Zelensky was over the course of last month was a great guy and was absolutely necessary. But right now, the Ukrainians need something else. They need a guy that is that same guy, only in the diplomatic table. Because now the lines have been, like I said, the positions have been taken, the battle lines have been defined, the war is going on, and it's standing in a little bit of a stalemate. I mean, the Russians aren't really moving that much. They have logistical problems, their morale is poor, the chain of command is just a mess. One officer after the other is falling, their equipment is oftentimes outdated and poorly maintained. They can't make the push they want to make. The Ukrainians are trying to regain ground whenever possible. However, might not have the numbers or logistical capabilities for a complete and overwhelming counteroffense. So that kind of leaves the two parties in like a status quo. And that is oftentimes where diplomatic relations will prove to be the deciding factor, as I think is the case right now in Ukraine. So what you need to do now is you need to understand, as Zelensky, as the president of Ukraine, that you have won the first round. The first round is on you. Even though that you didn't beat the Russians back, even though you're still at war, it doesn't matter. If you stop a blitzkrieg from an invading party, and the invading party has failed in its attempt to overtake the entirety of its objective of your country and your territory within a matter of days, you've won the first round. Because as the victim, so to speak, in war, as the defended side, that's what you need to do initially. You defend. You defend the first blitzkrieg. Then you regroup and you determine what to do next. And that's where Zelensky is at right now. However, when you realistically look at the Ukrainian military and you look at the opposing force of the Russians, forming a counteroffensive will be problematic. And it will even put you as much danger of becoming like the Russian sides are now: poor morale, poor logistic, poor maintenance, and just unable to push through. That might happen to the Ukrainian counteroffensive if they decide to do an impulsive counteroffensive right off the bat, without the proper logistical capabilities, the proper chain of command, the proper structure, and the proper numbers to do so. So that leaves us again at the diplomatic table, so to speak. Now, the sounds from Russia have been very positive, in my opinion. I mean, Putin is willing to keep going to the negotiating table. He's willing to negotiate. He's willing to talk to the Ukrainians. And he's even said that he will adjust some of his objectives regarding the war in Ukraine. And he will now focus solely on the eastern side of Ukraine. This is incredible news, Ukraine, because what he's basically saying is, I realize that my country's military is poorly prepared in order to make the push necessary right now. However, we're not decided to surrender yet because we can't lose face and we still have some sort of political agenda that we want to uphold to our people at home. So we can't surrender. So we're going to use this sort of meta language. And slowly, steadily, we're trying to save face. We're still trying to held some of our objectives. Absolutely wonderful. But as the Ukrainian president, that's what you should capitalize on straight away. The time for warmongering should stop. From Zelensky, from the European leaders, especially from Joe Biden, who has shown that he's incredibly incapable of running a country, let alone mediating into a war zone. So you should be now focused solely on making these negotiating talks as efficient as possible. The first thing that comes to mind when you do this is the realization that compromises need to be made. So if you go to a negotiating table without any will or any capacity to make compromises, you shouldn't even be there. because that's what negotiating is all about. You're trying to make a compromise in order to end the war with the most important ones of your objectives still intact, but also satisfying some of the objectives of the other party. That's what a compromise is. So that's what needs to be done right now. Now, what for Russia is the most important part right now? What did they say the first time before they started entering Ukraine? They said that there was a special peace operation, a special military operation, peacekeeping operation, whatever you want to call it, solely focused in order to liberate the eastern provinces of Ukraine, Luhansk and Donbass. Okay, Luhansk and Donbass have been under pro-separatist control for the last 8 years. It's never been under proper Western, you want to call it that, Ukrainian democratic control in the first place. So if you know that your enemy has interest in that part of land, if you know that the people or the parties active in those pieces of land are very pro-Russian and will have a very hard time adjusting to accepting your democratic government, even after the Russians hypothetically have left, you might think, okay, look, they weren't even under our control for the past 8 years. We have lost a lot of men, a lot of logistics, and a lot of resources in trying to reclaim them. Maybe it's realistic to assume that we might not reclaim them in the short term. That's why we might allow the Russians to take them into their territory. And this might seem very controversial for some people. And it might seem, but you're giving the Russians what they want. Yes, you're giving the Russians what they want to a certain degree. But that's what you have to do in order to form a compromise. So what you have to look when forming a compromise is, okay, this is what the Russians want. Give it what the Russians want. But does it really hurt me? And the answer here should be no, it doesn't really hurt Zelensky because Zelensky haven't got control of Luhansk and Donbass in the past 8 years. So for him thinking that it is the same as his territories in Kiev, Lviv, Odessa, Mariupol, it's a wrong thing to assume. So these, just as the people in 2014 in Kiev decided to go on the street, protesting, demonstrating, trying to form a new democratic government, so are these pro-Russian separatists trying to keep attached to Russia. So let them. So let them. So that's what Zelensky, in my opinion, should do. Crimea hasn't been under Ukrainian control for the past 8 years. Luhansk hasn't been under Ukrainian control for the past 8 years. So has Donbass. Give it to them. Now, the other thing that the Russians are both probably demanding and will stick to at the negotiating table is NATO membership. They don't want Ukraine to become a NATO member because Putin, you have to realize Putin's mindset is still based on 1985, 1975, 1965, the Cold War. He thinks he's still in the Cold War. Whether he's right, whether he's wrong, it's a totally different subject altogether. But that's his reality. So you should accommodate to that reality to a certain degree. So why does Putin feel threatened? Putin feels threatened because he's afraid that all NATO will, from north to south, will come straight to his border. It's already happened. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Turkey in the south. All these four countries are now NATO members. Finland is on the list to be NATO eligible by 2025. So there's a good chance that Sweden and Finland will join NATO around this time period, which means that the northern side of Russia, the mid-northern side of Russia, and the southern side of Russia are the member state. And for Putin, this is like in his perception of the world, this is unacceptable. It's an unacceptable security risk. And if you look at it through his glasses, if you look at it from his perception, he's right. I mean, if I hypothetically were at odds or in a Cold War with a said party, I wouldn't want him at my borders also. I would want some space. I would want some strategic assets. I would want some territory between me and the opposing force, just for general peace of mind, let alone strategic reasons. So there's a certain truth or a certain realism in the approach, not necessarily in the perception, but in the approach that comes with the perception. So you should accommodate to a certain degree. You should ease the tension. You should ease the fear. You should ease the concern. So that's what Zelensky needs to do now. So one easy way of doing this is pledging that you won't join NATO at all. You will sign some form of neutrality, maybe being overseen by the United Nations, signed by China. Very important in my opinion, because it's Putin's go-to ally, as it seems, in these times. So you will make a draft, you will sign it, you will sign some sort of neutrality agreement overseen by the United Nations, internationally applicable, and you will erase most of that concern. Now, what do the Russians want? The Russians want the denazification, as they call it, of Ukraine, which is, of course, an absurd notion. It's total propaganda, it's total indoctrination. Neo-Nazism is not larger in Ukraine than it is in Russia itself. Um, and that means being an overthrow of the current democratic government of Ukraine. Should Ukraine agree with that? Absolutely not. Zelensky has won too much ground in these last couple of weeks, has shown himself to be a very popular figure, has been very symbolic to the will and needs of the Ukrainian people, the voice of the Ukrainian people to speak. So he should definitely not agree with that and stand his ground. The demilitarization of his forces is also something that I wouldn't agree with right now, because you have already said that you were going to be neutral and you already signed a neutrality agreement that you would never become a NATO member. So the fear of Ukraine's military is totally unjustified after such said neutrality agreement has been signed. So again, you're giving and you're maintaining. So you're standing strong and at the same time be flexible. And it's a very delicate balance. And some of the best politicians and best leaders and best generals in the world had a very hard time with this throughout history. But oftentimes, it's the most effective way forward, especially in armed conflicts such as these, where two parties are in a form of status quo. One is not really dominant or just doesn't have enough dominance in order to completely conquer or dominate the other side. So, meaning the diplomatic compromise is the only way going forward. Now, if Zelensky does this, what does he achieve? He achieves Russian forces leaving his country, which should be his highest priority. Russian forces leaving his country, Ukraine still being democratic, Ukraine still being independent. Um, Only Ukraine is not a NATO member. Big deal. It wasn't a NATO member to begin with. It wanted to be one, but it wasn't. Secondly, increase diplomatic relationships with Europe. Over the course of the past few weeks, Europe has shown a very positive attitude towards Ukraine, shown that they were willing to help them and support them economically, meaning that potential membership of, let's say, the European Union is something on the table and is something that he might pursue because it's economic rather than military and will drastically aid the economy of his country. Okay, you lose Crimea, you lose Donbass, you lose Luhansk. But let's be honest, these territories were not even in your control to begin with before the Russian invasion. So again, you don't really lose much that you already hadn't lost to begin with. Um, so Ukraine must not become overzealous. Ukraine must realize that yes, they have done an effective job, an incredible job of stopping the Russian advance. They've even done as much as maybe to completely neutralize the Russian advance altogether if they continue down this path. However, is a war of attrition really in the best interest of your own people? This is something that you really want to put your people through. And again, you don't know what's going to happen in later phases. Right now, Putin is still mostly applying conventional weapons. But he has already shown that he's willing to increase the level of firepower, that he's willing to increase the brutality of force and violence that is being used right now. What will he do after, let's say, a year? What will he do after, let's say, 2 years? What will he do if he becomes really desperate? If the Russian economy is really sinking? If the pressure from his oligarchs is really coming high? What will he do then? Will he maintain the same level of composure, or will he panic and focus on very, very, very destructive forms of weaponry that can easily escalate into a regional war and even escalate in the long run into a complete world war? That's something all parties should want to avoid at all costs. At all costs. So for Ukraine and for Zelensky in particular, it's very important to consider, yes, we needed the rhetoric of iron fists, fighting hard, going all in, balls out in the first phase. But now we need a different rhetoric. Now we need a rhetoric of calm, composure, balance, confidence, yes, but also flexibility and adaptability. Because you will need to give in order to get. And still, the best outcome for both Russia as well as Ukraine will be a diplomatic solution to this. It will cost the least amount of lives, it will increase the least amount of tensions, and it will maintain the balance as best as is currently possible. So, this is what Zelensky should do. Not just Zelensky, but any other leader or general that finds himself in a current situation, such as, let's say, the Ukrainian and Russian military. You need to be able to adapt, still talk from a form of confidence, but also realize that when military means create a stalemate, diplomatic means can often turn the tide. Because definitely in modern warfare, most of the time peace is in both parties' best interests, even if it's the aggressor. Just most of the time, the aggressor is inflicting damage from a perception that can either be wrongful, can either be paranoid, or either be preconceived or misguided that he is. You should make sure that the concerns are neutralized. You should look into the psychology of the man. So if you look at Putin and you want to talk to Vladimir Putin and you want to put him in a certain direction, you first have to understand how his brain works. You first have to understand how his mind works, how his thought pattern works. Like, what is this guy thinking? Okay, so for this guy, the West is the ultimate enemy. So if I stop threatening or stop pursuing interests of aligning with said Western military alliances, and how much will that take away his concern or his preconceived notion of me hypothetically being a threat to the existence of Russia's borders? Okay, a lot. No NATO at your border means more strategic freedom, means less danger, means less risk. Wonderful. So that's one way you can act and you can play into the mind of your opponent. Um, Putin might do exactly the same thing. Putin will try in this situation to gain as much of his objectives as possible without losing face. Because deep inside, he knows, okay, the intelligence that I was provided by my military advisors prior to this invasion have been plain out wrong. They're most likely intelligence estimates based upon personal agenda by the military advisors who wanted to save face themselves, who didn't want to go against the policies already laid out by Putin, who was already very leaning towards an invasion for many months before it actually happened. And that's what you get with a totalitarian regime. People become frightened, people want to save their own ass, people are going to make up things. They want to make you believe that they're on your side, that they are, that whatever you are doing, it's going to work and it's going to work exclusively and incredibly well for you. However, this was not the case. So Putin is not stupid. Putin has been a very experienced politician for many years. So he thinks to himself, okay, what I wanted, the complete control of Ukraine, probably isn't going to get it anytime soon. My forces are depleted, my morale is low, my logistics are out of control, my economy is shattering below, my generals are incompetent, the chain of command just doesn't work, and my military equipment is more outdated than I thought it would be after a decade of military reformations. Okay, that's what you know. But I'm a strong leader. I have a very strong agenda at home. I have strong ties with oligarchs. I need to keep them in control. I need to be in a position of power. Why? Because my entire totalitarian regime has been based upon my notion or perception that I am indeed the most powerful leader in the political landscape. So you want to save that image, while at the same time give him some freedom to retract. Again, he is not stupid. He knows this war is lost. The objective of completely conquering Ukraine and installing a puppet government isn't gonna work. It isn't. It's done. It's visible. It's not gonna happen. It just isn't gonna happen. The only thing that's gonna happen by continuous warfare is either a war of attrition, which might take place, as we saw in Afghanistan, for potentially decades, or just complete destruction with weapons that no country in the world wants to be seen applied. So you need to have some sort of third route here. And Putin's third route is, okay, I have to save face. Well, securing, according to my perception, my own security risks and my own security guarantees for my own borders, while at the same time living with a neighbor that I know will remain neutral in any potential conflict between East and West. So that's what your objectives will be. And he will try on the negotiating table to gain more objectives. He will try to do it diplomatically. He will push very hard for what he calls the removal of Nazism from Ukraine, which is, of course, it's a stupid ideology, and it's based on nothing except propaganda and indoctrination for his own home front. But it's something that, as Zelensky, you need to deal with. And one of these things to deal with is to create some form of common mutual flexibility and respect. So, for example, you say, I understand your concerns regarding NATO. I understand your concerns regarding the border security. I totally understand. Let us sign a neutrality agreement that we won't become part of NATO in our future. And again, we're talking about Vladimir Putin, who is almost 17 years old. He isn't going to live forever. So the agreements you make today might not necessarily be the agreements that you will live to in 50 years from now. This is where many politicians make a mistake. They think too much on the short term. Well, as I just told you, warfare and political tension, it goes in phases. And not one phase is the same. In each of these phases, the world might be completely different than the one in the phase before. So you need to realize that. You need to make your decisions firmly, well thought out, yes, but also with a certain relativeness about them, a certain superficial attitude towards them, because they might change at any time in your near or long term future. So you give him some security to ease his mind. The more the mind is eased, the easier Putin will be eligible for concrete diplomatic negotiations. And that's where you, Zelensky, you and the Ukrainian diplomats need to take advantage of in turn. So, in my opinion, this war will be decided on a negotiating table. It's what's best for both parties. If it's not, then we can look at a war of attrition for many, many years with no clear victor in the end. After all, it will crumble the Russian economy even more. It will cripple quality of the Ukrainian people. It will just be complete destruction without any clear tactical or strategic victory from either side, because we've already seen that neither side, military in terms of military strength and capability, is capable of achieving that in the near short term. We've already seen that, otherwise it already would have happened. So the negotiating table for both parties is the best way forward. So what do we take away from this? We take away from this that a leader in wartime needs to have various phases for various phases of war. Not one phase in the war is the same. It's not all cannonballs, bullets flying around, and rockets flying around. It's strategy, it's chain of command, it's logistics, it's economics, it is politics, it's propaganda, it's influence, it's wits, and it's strategy. It's also playing to the mind of the other person. What does the other person want? How does the other person think? And how can I best assume a strategic position within that mind frame of my opposition? And that's one of the most important things, and it's often overlooked, even by the supposed leader of the greatest country in the world, Joe Biden, at the moment, who has done absolutely nothing in order to ease tensions, only increase them, in my opinion. That's all I wanted to share with you today. If you have any nice suggestions for new videos, new material, just write them down in the comments below. Any questions I might also answer. I will also post this clip on Twitter. I will also post it on LinkedIn probably in the next few days. So thank you for listening to this clip. I hope it was informative, and I wish you a pleasant day. Thank you very much.